Hello and welcome back to Textile Build. Thanks so much for joining us today for our fourth live Textile Build training session. So here's the basic structure for today. By the end of today's session, you should have a fully working distributed app that covers most of the basis of what we've covered these past few sessions. And that's a lot of stuff, so we'll be spending more time, in fact, pretty much the whole session today, actually going through and modifying code together. And at the very least, looking through all the differences that we've sort of developed along the way. We'll also try to build some of these features in a more step-by-step fashion, and we'll cover some of the stuff that we started with last class. So similar to last time, for those of you joining us live, please note that there are multiple ways to ask questions and interact with the Textile Build team during this live session. You can use the link at the top of the screen. You can join our Slack channel, or you can use the icons here if you have the slides open, and it'll take you to either of those two places where you can ask questions. As always, be prepared to get your hands dirty during today's session. Make sure you have your IPFS daemon running locally, your terminal is prepped and ready to go, and your copy-paste skills are primed and ready to go as well. You may need to think about starting your IPFS daemon with the pub sub experiment enabled, but we will talk about that a little bit later on in the session if you need to stop and restart it. Okay. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be focusing almost entirely on coding in this session. We ran a bit short on time during our last session, so we're going to start with examples from that class, from our previous DAP iteration, and then we're going to work on some new but related P2P communication example, which will then link to our larger profile DAP towards the end of today's session. So we're going to focus on three main tools for our DAPs today. IPFS/IPNS, which we've already been playing with quite a bit, building with a model view model design pattern, or MVVM, and working with a publish subscribe communication pattern for our P2P component. What we should end up with is a final draft, if you will, of our profile DAP. And the best part is we're going to deploy part of it, at least, publicly on IPFS so that it can be made available to the wider public rather than doing what we've been doing so far, which is just running it as a local server on your machine. So part of it will still run locally, and then part of it will access from IPFS. Okay, so unlike most previous sessions where we've got a bit of a build-up and some more conceptual ideas, we're just going to jump straight into doing some coding. So let's just learn by doing and dig right in by adding and deploying our interactive distributed app. Okay, so we'll try to take this slow, and I'll try to give everybody enough time that they could actually follow along in real time if they'd like to. So if you're joining us for the first time, or you're kind of catching up from previous sessions, or you haven't been following along with the code in previous sessions, then make sure you have Node.js installed, and refer to the second session notes if you'd like some steps on how to do that. And then make sure that you've git cloned the template repo, which is line 1 here at the top, because we're going to be working and building off of that. So I've actually already created multiple different versions of the DAP that we're working on today, but I'm also going to try and start a step that we've had, so that we don't spend too much time just building up from scratch. But you should be able to sort of jump between branches today so that you can get a feel for what the finished product is that we're aiming for, as well as how we got there. So we're going to start with basically where we left off last session. So if you want, you can actually just check out the build profile demo MVVM intro branch and install all the packages needed there, and then start developing on it by running yarn watch. So that's one way we can start. You can actually stick with the Textile DAP, and you can build up a bit more from scratch that way. I'll give you a couple of different options. And I'll show you what we're going to do in the next slide so that you can follow on and do exactly what I'm doing here. As always, once you've cloned the project, make sure that you can at least build it before we get into things much further. And if you do have any issues, make sure that you reach out on Slack or the live audience tools link so that someone can help you figure out what's going on there. Anyway, so I'm going to wait a second and see if there are any questions. And then just get ready to sort of git clone and git check out things as we go along. So far, we don't have a ton of people logged in. A lot of people will probably be checking this out after the fact, so they can pause it. Okay, so one quick aside before we dig into some code is, and we talked about this last session, but again, if you're joining us for the first time or you need a refresher, here's some information here. So in the past few iterations of our DApp, we've used window.ipfs is required or window.ipfs fallback to make sure that we're using the Windows IPFS object provided by the IPFS companion browser extension. And that's been pretty handy because it means we can essentially connect to our local IPFS daemon from the browser. However, as I mentioned last week, IPNS support in the IPFS JavaScript library hasn't been released yet. And window.ipfs doesn't actually let us publish hashes. So we're actually going to take a different approach with the DApp that we started last week and that we're working on this week, where we're actually going to use the IPFS API package to interact with our local daemon directly rather than through the browser extension. But frankly, it's useful to know that there are multiple ways to interact with an external IPFS peer in the browser anyway, so it's probably good to know that you can do this and access things this way in the first place. So we're going to use IPFS API. It's a JavaScript wrapper around the local IPFS API. So it actually interfaces with your locally running daemon directly. But one thing you do need to modify to be able to use this is you'll likely need to enable cores on your local API. And these three commands at the bottom of the screen here should do the trick. Basically, we're just going to allow cores on your local host and then allow credentials and put, post, and get methods. And you can just call IPFS config and just copy and paste these lines. And so what you'll have to do is stop your IPFS daemon, which you can do with IPFS shutdown or just Control-C to stop your daemon. Then you can edit your config, and then you can fire your daemon back up with IPFS daemon. So you can go ahead and do that and add these commands. Now, I've already done that, so I'm not going to skip off these slides, but make sure that you do that. Okay. Now, incidentally, next session, we're actually going to talk about other tweaks to your IPFS peer and daemon that you might want to explore, like these ones, to kind of tweak how you interact with IPFS. And so we'll spend a little bit of time next session talking about that. Okay, so here's our ultimate goal for this first part of the session. It's the same profile DApp that we had before, but like last week, we're going to make it possible to edit your profile. So we'll just dive right in. If you want, click on the link in the slides here at the bottom, or go to the build/profile demo MVVM intro branch of the template DApp repo and click compare to get a diff from the original profile demo branch. And we'll go through this diff together because there's quite a bit of changes there. Plus, you can copy and paste from there into your local DApp if you want to make those changes, or you can just check out the profile demo MVVM intro if you want as well. And I have some code commands for that earlier on in a slide. It might be handy to do that just so you have the code around to play with. The only other thing you'll want to do is open up your main.js and your index.html files for that project using your favorite editor or IDE. I generally use Atom for these. It's a text editor from the group at GitHub, but whatever you use is fine. And for the most part, I'm going to try and stick to these slides so we're not jumping back and forth. And for that, I've just got images of the diffs off of GitHub so that you can kind of see what's going on. So if you click on the diff here on the screen and go to the GitHub page, you should be able to follow along quite nicely with me. So essentially what we would do to get to that goal is we'd start off by just incrementally adding complexity or simplifying our DApp. So the first thing we might do is, we would go git checkout build profile demo. That's where we left off 2 sessions ago, and add and remove a couple of dependencies. So we'll add knockout and knockout mapping and IPFS API. So knockout is our MVVM controller, and knockout mapping is a plugin to allow us to directly map our JSON data structure to a view model. And then IPFS API is the library we'll use to interact with our local daemon. And since we don't really need the window checking libraries and the queue library, which was there from a previous example, we can just remove those. And then we can yarn watch that and start editing files. So now that we've updated our dependencies, what we're essentially going to do in this first step is keep the same look and feel as our existing profile DApp, but we're going to switch over to using this MVVM pattern to manage UI state. And you'll see that we're actually going to remove some of the code that we had before and actually simplify the overall app a little bit. And there's a link to some MVVM information at the end of these slides for reference if you like. All right. So what we can do is we'll just take it from the top, and we can explore the diff to get a feel for the minimal changes that are required. So I'm going to actually click on this diff and work through it with you. Or sorry, I'm going to go through the diff on the slides here and work through it with you, but you can actually explore it directly using the links on the slide. So we'll play around with this a little bit. So we'll start by updating our imports, which we talked about a minute ago. And there's nothing super crazy here, but there's a few extra packages to help us along. And don't ask me why I changed from jQuery to jQuery. That part doesn't really matter. You can actually ignore that. But what we are adding is knockout mapping, and IPFS API, and we're dropping a few of the other imports that we had. So that's easy, and that's just up at the top of our main.js file. So we'll start by updating those. Then we'll initialize our IPFS peer. So if you go down a little bit further on that particular file, you'll see some stuff here. So first things first, we've added a loader to give some feedback to our user so that they can see that we're actually doing something and the page isn't just sitting there. And so that's just a spinner loader so people can see that work is happening. But the real big change is here we've changed this to use IPFS is equal to IPFS API rather than the fallback or anything else like that. So here I'm assuming that you're using the sort of default setup so that API is running on localhost on port 5001. But if that's not the case, you'll want to actually add some parameters here. And you can check out the documentation for JS IPFS API for details. And there's a link at the end of the slides if you want to jump down there and go check it out. Essentially, you would just have to specify the host and port if it's other than the default IPFS settings. Okay, so that's that. Then the part where we actually grab the profile JSON using IPFS and we resolve the hash, etc., hasn't actually changed. So that's actually hidden here, and it's not showing up on my diff here. So that makes that part easier, and there's very little changes happening there. In fact, all this bit here is left unchanged. Then down at the bottom of this piece of code here, this is for our setup function, we create our view model. And what this is really just a Knockout.js representation of our input JSON structure. So it's really quite a nice, simple application here. Our application logic according to our profile data. So this keeps things clean. It's easy to apply the bindings to, and it'll make the next few steps quite simple. Notice that we've also removed the call to build page and we've actually completely deleted that build page function, because now we're going to use Knockout.js bindings to do all of the UI stuff for us. Oops. And so that's pretty much it. These are the two sort of important additional lines of code, and then we just turn the spinner off once we've actually set everything all up. So from there, we'll actually start to bind the UI elements to our view model. All right. So here is a snippet from the HTML or index.html file. As you can see, this is where most of the new code can be found. And we're basically just defining normal HTML elements to describe our look and feel, and then binding them to our view model observables so that they can be updated and can update our model. So it's pretty simple. And we'll go through this a little bit here, and then we'll take a look to see how it all kind of pans out. So we get cut off a little bit due to the link at the top here. But essentially what we're doing is defining our divs and the classes just like we did before, except now we're actually binding elements to them. So for instance, in our name div here, we're actually going to use the data bind data property to bind the text of this span to the name.first property of our view model. And then we're going to bind the text of this one to the name.last so that we get two spans sitting next to each other with first and last names. Then in our work class, or our work div, we're going to go through each work item because that's actually an array of jobs. And then we'll add a list item for each one. And then within that, a header where we bind the text of these two spans to the title of our job and our employer. And then similarly, we've got a bio. And so in our bio div, we're going to bind the text to the bio element from our view model. Again, this is just almost direct mappings to our JSON structure. And then for our social section where we've got our social media links, we've got a list. We're going to go through each social object in our array, create a link with its href equal to the URL found within there, and we'll actually create a little icon for it based on the font awesome fonts. So these actual pieces are very similar to what we were doing when we actually manually updated the app features before, except now we're letting Knockout.js do it for us. All right, then the only other thing is up at the top there, we need to actually specify our image. And because we want the image to resize to the full height of the page, we actually specify it as a background image. And so we bind the style of that image div background image to the URL from our pick element in our JSON structure. And so this is just using some nice ES6 string interpolation techniques to kind of make that a bit simpler. But we also covered that in a previous iteration. So relatively simple and straightforward application. You can copy and paste that whole HTML file if you'd like, and you can start to play around with it. And what you should get if you haven't modified any of the CSS is you should have a dApp that looks a little bit like this. And it's really not much different from our previous iteration. And if you apply some CSS, it ends up looking like this. And now we have basically exactly reproduced our past dApp, this time using MVVM design pattern. So that's pretty simple. And now we can start adding functionality to make our dApp even more accessible and more powerful. And by adding this baseline MVVM pattern, we'll be able to make those modifications a little bit easier. Okay. So I am going to take a quick look to see if we have any questions along the way, and just check the Slack channel here, and then we'll move along. Okay, so we have one person. That is probably a bigger question, but Troy says he looks like he has everything working other than loading the initial JSON. So the only thing to keep in mind there is, Troy, did you, going through our second session, did you create and add and then publish a JSON file with your information to your IPFS peer ID? If not, then what you can actually do is, instead of just loading up localhost at port 8000, you can use my profile instead. So you could go to, I'm just going to type it into the Slack channel here. And I will so if you open that, that should actually take you to my profile if you have that running. And then not only will it look something like this, but it probably will look exactly like this. So let me know if that fixes it, and I'll continue on a little bit here. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start to add a little bit of complexity to our DApp. So again, what you can do is you can git check out build. Oh, now I've lost the name of the branch, the profile MVVM branch without the demo part. So you could git check out that branch, and now we've kind of stepped it up a little bit, and you can start playing around with that code. Alternatively, you can jump over to this GitHub link, and you can start copying and pasting code into your main.js and index.html files to update things. Either way, we will be able to build things up a little bit as we move along. So I'm actually going to go ahead and click on this link, and we're going to go through the actual comparison together. So what I've got here is a GitHub diff viewer, essentially. And we're going to compare the profile demo MVVM intro branch that we basically just created or just looked at with the profile demo MVVM branch, which kind of contains all of the editable content stuff. So we'll skip past dist because that we just create from our source files. And we'll jump right down to our main.js file. And so what we're actually going to do is we're going to, and you can follow along with the slides and on the GitHub link with me right now if you'd like. So for now, we're actually just going to ignore the custom binding handlers here. It's really beyond the scope of our current session. And frankly, I just pretty much copied and pasted this directly from a Stack Overflow question anyway. So this just allows us to have content editable elements that get updated in a slightly lazy fashion when we click on them. Get back to it here. So we're going through here. We can ignore this. It just allows us to lazily update the HTML elements as we're editing them. So the really important two functions are handle data update and handle image select. And they look pretty long, but as you can see, I've basically commented every single line of code so that if you're following along at home, all of this stuff makes a little bit more sense and is a bit easier to follow. So we'll start with this handle data update function. So this is an async function to handle when our view model gets updated and we want to publish our new, we want to IPFS add and then publish our new profile data. So And I'll show you where when we actually call this function in a moment. But once we actually are about to update the data, what we do is first we check to make sure that we're not in editing mode anymore. Okay, so what we want to be able to do is click Start Editing the Profile, and then click Save the Profile, and have that happen after we're done editing. So if we're still editing, we don't want to send any messages out. And then just to give some visual feedback to the user, we'll start our spinner loader so that they can see what's going on, or see that something's happening. So first things first, what we're going to do is extract the data from our view model. So we export our view model to JS. In this case, it creates a JS object. And then because Knockout mapping has actually added a bunch of keys to our object, we want to remove those from our data object here. So this is just a little bit of housekeeping or cleaning up. So we delete the data underscore underscore ko underscore mapping underscore underscore. Then what we'll do is we'll convert it to JSON string, because that's how we created it in the first place. And if we didn't edit anything, we want IPFS to not actually create a new hash and waste time. So then I have a couple of options here for when we actually add the file to IPFS. Currently, I pretty much have these just set to their defaults, with the exception of I've added wrap with directory is equal to true, because that's how we did it originally in our previous sessions, where we wrapped our JSON data in a directory. Then what we'll do is we'll just create a binary buffer from our JSON string, right? So we've stringified our JSON to create a JSON string, and then we just create a buffer from that. And then, and this is just a sort of binary array, essentially. And then the new file will just do IPFS files add, or you could do IPFS add directly, which is basically the same thing we do on the desktop. And then, so from there, we just await for that. So this is an async function. We just wait for that to continue. And then once we have the result from that, we will then publish that hash to our IPNS, or our peer ID. So we publish the new file to our peer ID. So IPFS name publish. And in this case, we're because we've wrapped it in a with the options here, because we've wrapped it with a directory, we actually want to get the hash of the second element, which is actually the hash for the directory. The first element is the file itself, and in this case, the second element is the directory. So we grab that, and then we can just, console log that we published an update. And if anything went wrong, we could just log that we had an error, and then turn off the loader now that we're done with everything. So actually, the only two really tricky possibly pieces of code here are that we convert our view model to JavaScript, and then that we're going to actually publish things after we're done with them. So nothing particularly crazy there. It's just a few extra lines of code to do this. Now, very similar to this, we have our handle image select function. And essentially, this allows us to open up a file upload dialog and deal with the file that we get back. And so in order to be able to do that, what we'll actually do is bind this function to a click event on our edit pick button. And so I won't dwell on this too much, because actually this will be some homework that you can do for next session to actually link this up to the handle data update function. Because right now I have at the bottom here, how/where would you call the handle update function to actually publish this change. So I won't dwell on this too much, but essentially what we do is we actually grab the data from the uploaded image file, create a buffer from that, and add it to IPFS. Then we create a link to that image, which we then add to our view model. And then the key thing to do here is then we have to tell IPFS that we've updated our profile information, and then publish it under our peer ID. So I leave that as an exercise to the viewer. Okay, then at the bottom, our setup file has changed very little. The only thing that we've added here is we've still got our mapping from JSON to our view model. The only thing we've added is an extra observable to keep track of when we're editing. And then a few new UI elements so that we can actually edit the data. And so in this case, we have an image select and we have an edit button. And we created those in our actual index.html file. And then you can add a little bit of styling as well if you'd like. Okay, so with that, we then should end up with essentially a DApp that supports structured user profile information, provides us the means to edit profile information in a relatively user-friendly way, and the look and feel screen necessarily, although of course this is a demo app, so it's not full featured. And then what we're going to do next, right after a quick check for any questions, is we're going to add a decentralized chat system to our profile so that you can keep up with your followers as they're checking out your profile. And then we'll come back to our profile DApp and we'll combine them together. All right, so we'll get started on that in a moment, but this is our ultimate goals. We're going to create a little DApp that would run next to your profile so that you can see what your users think of your great work. So I'm going to quickly jump over to check if there are any audience questions. And over in the Slack channel. All right. There you go. So it doesn't look like we have any questions, so we can keep going. Make sure they. Right. So, as always, I've included a diff on the screen here so that you can check out this version of our template app. But again, I'm going to try and go through sort of step by step so that you can see how we create this app and then how we combine them together. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to create a whole separate DApp as a new clone of our DApp template. And we're going to essentially start from scratch here and then use them together later on. And there's a couple reasons why we're starting from scratch and not just adding to our existing DApp, and I'll go over those in a second. But essentially, what the goal eventually here is that we might have a profile DApp that looks like this. And we'd like to be able to have a little chat option at the bottom here so that when a user comes to our profile, they can click on that and a little chat option will pop up and say, we could say something like, "Hi, welcome to my profile page," and we can interact with our visitors. And we're going to do this in a pretty basic way without any authentication and administration and anything like that. But the idea is you could obviously build on top of this idea quite easily. If we're doing it in a sort of cross-browser way, then this is on Safari, and we might get a version that looks kind of like this. All right, so that's the goal, and we should be able to do this relatively easily. The fun thing here is actually if I've got multiple browsers running, so here's my browser running in Firefox, and you'll notice that my username up at the top here I've made owner. So owner says, "Hi, welcome to my profile page." But in the meantime, I've also opened the DApp in a Safari browser, a separate browser, where my username is visitor, and I can interact with owner. So I can interact between, in this case, I'm sort of simulating users interacting on the web on my own machine by using two different browsers. Okay, so that's kind of our goal for today, or for the rest of the session. So let's get started. We're going to go back to basics to start with, and we're just going to grab the default DApp template. So we're going to git clone that, and I saved it or cloned it into a folder called DApp chat. And then nice and easy, what we're going to do is add a couple of libraries. We're going to add IPFS, IPFS pub sub room, knockout, and queried string. Note that we're not using knockout mapping or jQuery or anything like that. Then again, we can just get rid of some of the libraries that we don't use. So yarn remove q and window.ipfs fallback. And then if you've done that, you can just yarn watch the whole thing and start to edit it. So if you want to follow along, that's great. You can copy and paste in there. If you want to just start with a working version of this, I've actually also pushed this up as a separate branch on that DAP template repo. So instead of lines 2 and 3 above, you could use the following two, and you could check out the build / profile chat branch and then yarn install that stuff. So either or, I'm happy either way. We're going to go through things fairly line by line anyway. Okay, so let's dig in. So we're going to edit the script or the main.js file first. So again, we'll start by updating our imports. And in this case, there are a few differences here. So we're going to import room from IPFS pubsub room, and we're going to import IPFS from the IPFS library. And then the other two imports are actually the same as we had before. So IPFS, you'll note here, we're not using window.ipfs fallback. We're not using IPFS API. We're not using any of those. We're actually not going to use an embedded, or we're not going to use an external IPFS daemon at all this time around. What we're actually going to do this time around is we're going to spin up a IPFS peer in the browser. So it'll be a one-off peer every time someone loads the DAP. Now, if you load it multiple times from the same browser in the same session, it'll just be essentially the same with the same ID. But the idea is each new person that visits the site will actually spin up a brand new IPFS peer in their browser. And the reason we can do that, no problem here, is because we're not relying on anything like any IPNS publishing or anything like that. That makes it a little bit more difficult when we're running in the browser. Okay, so updated our imports. Let's take a quick look at our view model. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to create a function that just creates a brand new view model for us from scratch. And so this is a little bit different from before, where we automatically wrapped our JSON structure in a view model. Now we're going to define one from scratch. So just to make things easier for myself, I just created a reference to this and called it self, so that I can more easily update properties of this view model. It's a recommended design pattern from Knockout, so it's probably a good idea to play around with things that way. Anyway, I've commented each one of these. So we're going to create observables for various things. So we're going to keep track of the name of the user so that they can have a little username, so it shows up as not just their long peer ID. We're going to store the current or latest message. We're going to store an array of past messages. We're going to store the local peer ID so that we can actually communicate between peers. And then we're going to store whether we've successfully subscribed to the pubsub room once we fire that up. And I also track errors, but don't actually do anything with them at the moment, but just to show you that that's doable as well. And then we compute the IPNS link on the fly from the peer ID so that you could click on a user's profile and go visit their profile if you wanted. Okay, and then we just actually create a new view model this way, and then we apply the default bindings just like before. So this part's a little bit different. This part's pretty much the same as we had before. Okay, so we've created our view model, and again, you can just copy and paste this in if you like, or check out that branch. And then what we'll do is initialize our IPFS peer. Now, in the past, we've just basically created a new default IPFS peer, or we've connected to an existing one. But now we're actually going to modify the configuration of our IPFS peer slightly. And we wrap it in a try catch just so that if anything goes wrong, we can give some feedback to our users. So what we're going to do is when we instantiate our new IPFS object, we're going to turn on the experimental pub/sub feature. So just like on the command line where there's a flag for this, in the browser there's a flag for it as well. And while we're at it, we're actually going to add an address for swarm announcing. So we supply a swarm address to announce our location essentially, so that we can find other peers. Right. So this is the sort of default one that a lot of people use from libp2p.io's sort of discovery subdomain, and so you can use that, and it uses secure WebSockets. And so that's a sort of boilerplate. You can stick that in, and if you were running your own, you could run it that way as well. And then we just catch things if they don't go wrong or don't go right, and if they do go wrong, we update our view model with the error. Right, so nothing particularly crazy there. It's actually quite verbose with all of the tabbing and brackets and things, but we're essentially just firing up a new IPFS with pub/sub enabled. So then we'll actually start to add the chat functionality. So we'll skip to this next one here, and we'll use pub/sub room to actually start to interact with a pub/sub framework. So the pub/sub room module essentially abstracts away a lot of the nitty-gritty issues of actually publishing and subscribing to messages. But there are some limitations, and so that's one of the reasons why we're running this directly in the browser. So first of all, we can't access an external peer's pub/sub capabilities, so that's why we're running this directly in the browser rather than using window.ipfs. And so again, that sort of saves us the trouble of having to connect to an existing external IPFS daemon. But setting things up is really easy. All we need is a running IPFS peer instance in the browser and the name of the room that we want to create. And then interacting with the room is almost just as easy. So first things first, what we do is once our IPFS daemon is ready, and so we subscribe to its ready event, then what we'll do is we'll, like before, we'll parse the query string in case someone is trying to create a new room. And so what we'll do is the design pattern we'll use is if you want to chat about a particular topic, you would set that as the ID for the query string. And I'll show you how we'll use that in a little bit. Then we'll try and catch getting the peer's ID, which we're going to use for communicating. And then we're going to update the view model so that we set the view model's ID to the ID of the IPFS peer. Once we have that ID as the room ID for the topic of the room. So here we're going to create a room ID, and we're either going to use the ID from the query or the ID of the local peer from the view model. And then we just create a basic room, room equals room, where we feed it the IPFS, the running IPFS instance and our room ID. So pretty easy, and most of this stuff is just sort of nice niceties to create these unique rooms, or rooms unique to a particular user. You could stick whatever you want in here, a practice room or a test room or whatever. So that's setting things up, and then we can actually start to interact with the room or subscribe to events in the room to enable some chat features. So once the peer has subscribed to the room and we enable chat, what we're going to do is we're actually going to bind this to the view. Once the room says, okay, you've subscribed to this room, we're going to let the view model know and set subscribe to true. Now in our UI, we can enable certain features now that the user has actually subscribed to the room. And then when we receive a message, we've got a couple of things we want to do here. So we've got a callback here that happens every time we receive a message. So we parse the data, which is just JSON data. And then we are going to update the name so that we get the name from the user that sent us to us. And if the name is empty, then we'll just say, oh, it came from some anonymous user. And then we'll update the text just so that it's nice plain text instead of the data the JSON data. And then we just add this to the front of our messages array in our view model. And so we use unshift here to stick this message at the front so that we keep it at the bottom of this display like a traditional chat app. All right, and you'll see what that looks like in a second. So very simple, right? When we get a message, you just parse it, add, tweak the structure a little bit, and then add it to our view model. Easy peasy. And while we're at it, you can do some checks and things like that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to subscribe to the message property of our view model. Okay, so if we jump down there, we've got this view model subscribe. And again, if you go and check out the link on GitHub, then you can see all of this code in context. But anyway, what we're going to do is subscribe to the message changes on our view model, which would probably happen as a result of the user interacting. So like hitting enter after typing a message. And so what happens is when our view model's message gets updated, this callback will get run. In this case, we're using an async callback here. So first of all, if we haven't actually subscribed to the channel yet, or if the text that the user is trying to send is empty, just ignore it. We'll just hit return and don't do anything. If it's good, then we try and catch. First, we grab the name, our username from our view model, and we assign that to a variable. Then we get the current message, the one that initiated this update in the first place. So we grab the message from the view model. And then we broadcast to the room a buffered version of the JSON string that we get from including name and text. And so we kind of do that all in one line. Maybe it's a little bit more complicated, but essentially what we're doing is creating a JSON string, converting that to a buffer, a binary buffer, and then broadcasting that to the room. And we're not doing any encryption or encoding or anything like that. So we're sending this out in basically plain text. While we're at it, we do a couple of catching and things like that. We empty out our message when we're done. And then we add an event listener at the bottom here, just in case you leave the room. We want to clean up after ourselves. Okay, so now that we have all those pieces in place, we can jump over to index.html and wire everything up. So we'll start with a little house cleaning first and get rid of some things, change the name of our DApp. We don't need the footer and stuff like that. And then we'll move on to the sort of main event, if you will. Hilarious because it's the main div. So this is pretty much all we need to make our chat bindings work. So at the top, we want to have a little input where you can put your username. So that's what we have here. It's just a text input. And we're going to bind its value to the name of our view model. And then I just stick a placeholder in here so that you can give some feedback to your user. Then at the bottom here, we've got another input text box with a placeholder of type of message. And we're going to bind its value to message. And we're only going to enable it if the user is subscribed. All right, so if that subscribed element in our view model has been updated. And then finally, as our messages array builds up, we're going to go through for each message in there. And so here we say for each message in messages as message. So that just sort of is a nice syntax to make it a little bit easier to reference. Messages, we're going to create a link element which has the user's name who created the message, and then we're going to style it using whether or not it was the local user or some remote user, and we're going to create a href that links to that user's IPNS profile. So this is just some nice syntactic information, the username and coloring and things like that. And then the main thing is that we're going to bind a separate div whose text will be equal to the text of the message so that we actually get a building list of messages. Okay, so let's test this out. If you haven't done so already, you might want to yarn build this and then yarn start it and then open the page localhost 8000. In this case, we could set ID to test room, and you can just test that on your local machine. Now, if you still have the other DApp running, then you might get some issues when you use yarn start or yarn watch. So you might have to stop that other one first or change your default ports or whatever if you want. But what you can do, if you can start it up, is you can open that and then open up another window, maybe in private mode or using a different browser, and you can start talking back and forth between your tabs or between your windows. And so in a little bit, I'll fire that up and we can show an example live here. But if you want to start playing around with that and have a look to make sure it works. Okay, and then the neat thing here, the really useful thing, and then we're going to finish up here pretty quick, is because this particular DApp doesn't rely on any external IPFS peer, we can actually quite easily deploy it live over IPFS. And this is easy as these two commands here. In fact, really just the first command, right? And even simpler, if you just want to do it manually, would be just IPFS add recursively our dist folder. And so if you run IPFS add recursive dist, you will get some hashes back. So I'm going to actually just do that really quickly here. Let's see here. So we're going to cd into our DApp chat, yarn build. It's going to take a little while. So while that's building, this is just going to ensure that I'm running the latest version in my, or I have the latest version in my dist folder. So it's actually just copying everything to dist bundle.js, and it also is copying over my index.html and style files. Okay. So I'm getting a little bit impatient, so I'll check back on that in a second. So once we do that, we can deploy it. And then what we can do is we can actually then integrate that into our previous DApp. And this is the easy part. Our DApps are pretty simple, and they're both sort of standalone DApps. And we just use query parameters to control how they actually set things up. This probably isn't what you would want to do in production, obviously, but it is sufficient for examples. So what we're just going to do is add a chat link that automatically opens our standalone chat app with a query parameter set up for our peer ID, or the peer ID of the profile we're currently visiting, to create a peer ID specific room. And so in total, this is the additions we would have to make to our profile DApp. We would just add an HTML element as a link. We would maybe style it a little bit. And then we just have to do, we can use jQuery here so that when we click it, we create a href link. So this is just the, I've already run IPFS add to get a hash for that a whole dist directory. So I just add that in here. And then we create the ID query parameter equal to our IPNS address. And then we just call window.open to open it. And we can set it up so that we have this tiny little chat window where we've got it narrow, it's relatively high, with no menu bar, no toolbar, no location on, and no status on. And that will basically pop up our little chat viewer. So we get something that kind of looks like that. And if we jump over here, oops, if we jump here, add recursive dist, and we get back that we've added all these things, and here's the hash that we were looking for here, 7QK4. And then we go back here, and 7QK4 is the hash because I haven't modified anything. It's the exact same hash. And I've actually already added that to IPFS. Whoops. So if you click on this link here, it actually should take you to a live example. In this case, it's taking you to a live example, and I'm on full screen here, so it's sort of blown it up quite large. But if we jump over here, you can see that I've created a live example for my specific peer ID here. And so what I can do, oops, is pull this apart here. Okay, great. I'm going to do a little demo here. Then I'm going to open up one in Firefox. Okay. Here's another one in Firefox. And there we go. Move these onto the same thing here so you can see what's going on. So I've created a user Firefox. They've said hello, and they both show up here. Here, we'll call this one Safari. Hello back. Whoops. And now we have interaction between each other. And the way we have things set up, we can change the names. And the names will automatically get updated in the view model and sent across. And so what you can do is you can start to add interactions so that over on this window, we might, an administrator might say, so-and-so has changed their name, so-and-so is an administrator, so-and-so is the owner of this page, however you like. And you get a sort of nicely styled chat box. And if you start to add more messages and keep going, it will slowly fill up. And then it automatically scrolls so that you can look back at your past interactions. Now, we don't have any persistence. We don't have anything like that. So if we copy this and close it, and then open up a new one, we kind of start fresh and we've lost all that history. Oops. Now, there are ways to actually go back and recover some past text or past room history, but we'll not worry about that too much for now. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time now. So we'll get back to our slides here. And what we can do is end up with just linking this link back to our original DApp so that anyone who visits our page can click the chat link and will be brought to this particular room, which they can then use to interact. Obviously, if you're managing your own page, you would have to kind of sit there and wait as people interact with your room, which maybe isn't ideal, but it's a fun idea. Okay, so a couple of homework or challenges for this session. You could figure out how to enable one-on-one chats. You could figure out how to enable persistence of chats, maybe how to encrypt messages between peers, or deploy the profile and chat as a single DApp. Either way, play around with it, have fun, and then our last session is next Tuesday, where we'll kind of tie things up a little bit. We'll talk about different IPFS config options and a couple of other projects in the decentralized web space. So thanks a lot for joining us. Here are a few additional resources at the end of the slides. And as always, please do ask questions on our Slack channel. We're there to help. All right. Thanks a lot.